And so talking about Severodonetsk, this city in eastern Ukraine. So it's in the Donbass region. It means like northern part of the Donbass, Severodonetsk. In peacetime, it had a population of about 120,000. But since the war began, obviously, the majority of the population fled for their lives. Now, at last count, about 15,000 civilians in the city. So what's going to happen? Is it a salient? It's got options on three sides of them, and they're closing in. They're moving forward slowly, sometimes as little as a kilometer per day, but it's inexorable. And the city is just not something the Ukrainians can hold. Their position there is increasingly untenable. Three bridges across the river, two of which, well, one's been destroyed, one's within easy range of Russian artillery fire, and the other's just out of range, been hit a couple of times. And that's the vital link. But I thought, if they had some armored personnel carriers, they could get people in and out, those amphibious ones across the river. But, is that enough? How many people does an APC take? Like 20 most at a squish? I'm not a soldier. So this is necessarily speculative. Um, anyway, so I think the Ukrainians are going to come to the conclusion that their situation there can't be prolonged. They're going to have to withdraw. That was the quandary they were in, and they're caught on the horns of that dilemma. Do they reinforce their withdrawal? Now, in Azovstal factory, those steelworks in Mariupol, they held out for 10 weeks, about 6 weeks longer than anybody forecast. So now my clairvoyance sorry, my reputation for clairvoyancy in this conflict must be much impugned. Um, because I never thought the Ukrainians would obviously survive so long. I thought the war would be over by now, and everybody thought they're going to lose lose the battle for Kiev, but they won the battle of Kiev. Obviously, heavy losses on both sides, but I don't think they have the strength to fight the Battle of Severodonetsk or to win that. And is it even worth it? It's actually not that important. And the Russians will be taking over a heap of rubble. It's not that far from the Russian border. It's actually quite a Russophone city. It's the kind of thing where a place where Putin was telling himself and his troops that they'll be welcomed with open arms. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong. So when he called it a special military operation around the war, I think he believed it. He thought that it would just be a cakewalk. They could just roll in there, but they've obviously met with tough resistance, and the Ukrainians have got a much stiffer spine than anybody gave them credit for. But they're just going to have to pull out of Severodonetsk. If they can get all the civilians out, that'd be great, and all the soldiers, and ideally all the hardware. If not, destroy it. Just make it inoperable, because they don't want to give anything that possibly of use, leave it behind for the Russian army. Any civilians are left behind, well, some of them will be murdered. We know that the Russian army's done this on quite a large scale. That's documented as absolutely proof positive. These are not the fewer isolated incidents. Unfortunately, every army would commit. I know it's always wrong, but there are always going to be a few psychopaths who do this in any army, especially when criminous tendencies are unhinged by war or unreleased by war. People's minds are unhinged. They suffer this derangement of mind, and it just becomes normalized, just desensitized to it. I mean, if I saw someone shot dead, that would horrify me. I've never seen that. But if I've seen it 100 times already in the last month, I might just shrug it off. Um, it loses its power to shock. So anyway, the Ukrainians are just going to have to pull out of there. And I think within a week, even the mayor of Severodonetsk admitted the situation was grim from a Ukrainian perspective. And the next 10 days will be vital. I mean, I don't think they have 10 days, actually. And so pull back to more defensible positions where they've dug bunkers or whatever, anti-tank trenches, put minefields. They can really mine the city, which would really slow the Russians down, to clear it for mines. Otherwise, they have anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines. A lot of them are going to be killed. Um, because the Ukrainians, they obviously don't have such a reservoir of manpower as Russia does, and Russia's got obviously a problem with losing a lot of its manpower. So they invaded with about 200,000 troops, although some people say it's a few 167,000. NATO estimates about a third of those have been killed, wounded, or captured. Obviously, they've been able to call up more people. The annual draft is going to come in. That'll bring about another 130,000 troops. They've said there's no upper age limit if you want to volunteer to go back into the army, having done your temporary service. If you're coming to the end of your 1 year compulsory military service, you can choose to sign a contract and extend. And they're offering actually quite attractive golden hellos, but they're probably going to lie and not pay what they said. Another thing is, the Ukrainians are claimed to have taken out about 3,000 Russian tanks. Now, the Ukrainians are probably overstating that figure. Let's say it's more like 2,000. Now, Russia claims to have about 10,000 tanks, of which 3,400 are main battle tanks. I don't understand what the other kinds are. But as Russia lies about everything, presumably they've got fewer tanks than they claim they have. So more like 8,000. I just had to pluck a figure from the air. And it said that a lot of those are inoperable, been sitting in warehouses for years, also been cannibalized for spare parts. We know the Russians do not maintain their vehicles, and they got some really rudimentary things wrong, so that they just fail in the fundamentals of motor maintenance, let alone soldiering. Um, so if they've lost even 2,000 tanks of 8,000, of which not all of those are operable, it's actually been quite a blow to their arsenal. And yes, they can manufacture more. I don't know how fast they can manufacture more. So, and the mayor of Severodonetsk said it's too late to evacuate. You've got to stay in your shelters. It's actually more dangerous to be out there because so many shells are falling. But I wonder if the Russians are going to run low on shells. It seems maybe they have finally sorted out the logistic problems. That was all the headache. They weren't getting enough ammunition forward, fuel forward, and food forward. Um, and as I did say, that the weather would actually start to favour the Russians a bit, in as much as now that the ground is completely dry, you can drive off road in a truck or anything, and it's not going to sink into the mud. And that was one of the reasons for concentrating on eastern Ukraine. Is it's closer to the frontier with Russia, and obviously they've illegally occupied lots of Donetsk and Luhansk for 8 years, so they don't even have to go all the way back to Russia for their supplies. So I think they're just going to have to pull out because at Azovstal they were there, they were enveloped, they defended it for ages, but ultimately up to 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers surrendered, and that's over 1% of the Ukrainian army, and Ukraine can't afford to sustain such losses. And yes, they had about 900,000 reservists all called up. They talk about making a 1 million-man army and some women too. So other people, police were willing to fight and so on. Yeah, it's the thing, they might even be able to match the Russians. But if the casualties are like 1 for 1, the Ukrainians would run out of soldiers much sooner than the Russians would. But I mean, it seems that the Russians are suffering a rather higher later rate of loss. And the trouble is, the Ukrainians are not being provided with the weapon they should do. They obviously can make up for the lack of manpower by superior weaponry, I suppose, gallantry, skill, morale, and so on. So some Ukrainian generals have boasted they're going to win this war by August. I mean, I'm not so sure. But you've got to just make the war so costly that Putin concludes that it's not worth it. People in Camarilla may decide it's not worth it. And they're going to have to end the war, some sort of compromise. There's already been talking about the Italians, let's settle. Ukraine should be pressurized into ceding some of its territory, legally signing that over to the Russians. And Zelensky says, no way, we shall recover every last millimeter of our sacred soil. I mean, they might be able to halt the Russian advance. I don't see them being able to take back Luhansk and Donbass, and much less Crimea, which I think was really the top priority for Russia, which is what they first seized in 2014. Anyway, so yeah, not going very well for Russia. But let's face it, this is not easy for Ukraine, as President Zelensky has repeatedly said. Why does the Russian military perform so poorly? Yeah, good question. I mean, there are various reasons. There's partly corruption, officers stealing fuel, selling on the black market, stealing the winter tire, selling on the black market, having to use summer tires in winter. Well, now we're into summer, that's not such a problem. Just disorganization, just not a good system. The commissariat, in terms of getting food, fuel, and ammunition forward, they don't have NCOs as we would understand it. They were set a ludicrously overambitious task they just weren't up to, and really just lying, having to be yes men and not fess up to your boss. No, this is unachievable. No, we're not ready, and not training their soldiers very well. They rush through 4 months of basic training, and then they can be sent off to fight. And they have all these conscripts who do the basic training. And a lot of the army wastes its time doing basic training for the 1 year conscripts. By the time they become good soldiers, they're gone. So that's a problem as well. And although they do have some very sophisticated kit, there's very little of it. And just not doing due diligence, not looking after their equipment, inspecting and repairing their vehicles. So all sorts of things like that. They try and win by sheer weight of metal. That eventually tells. Numbers, firepower. It's not speed. It's not maneuverability. But the fact that you just wear down the enemy by bombarding him so much for ages was one of the reasons why they're also very slow, because then they run out of munitions. They've expended so many shells, so many missiles. Have to wait to get more. Run, be selective. Let's only blow up the buildings we actually need to blow up, and then we take the city, it's not completely wrecked. It still has some economic value. Because remember, the Russians are now openly talking about integrating more and more Ukrainian regions into Russia. They're going to claim Kherson as their own, stage a completely rigged referendum. Anyway, so then, but then you have to pay the cost of rebuilding that. So anyway, I obviously really want Ukraine to win, but not them the least bit Russophobic. There are Russians I'm very, very fond of. I've had Russian girlfriends and so on. There's a lot I admire about Russian culture. And unfortunately, ordinary Russian people are suffering. And it's all the fault of Putin and his coterie. But a lot of the good Russian people who believe the propaganda, and it's very hard not to. When 360 degrees around you, you are ceaselessly bombarded with propaganda. They're exploiting the tenderness of children by their brainwashing them in schools and so on, so-called patriotic education. And you should immediately be deeply suspicious about that. People should be hear different perspectives, should be willing to be critical of their country or their government and so on. You know, dissent is patriotic, dissent of which Putin is murderously intolerant. So it's very important, as Boris Johnson said, that he fails and be seen to fail. You know, Johnson sometimes is right, even though he's an absolute loathsome scumbag. On this one, he's been spot on. He's been fairly good. The United States and the UK supplied a lot of weapons, and I don't always praise the UK. The United Kingdom is certainly in the wrong sometimes, but I call the Republic of Ireland, my other country, to provide weapons. All EU and NATO countries. I know Ireland, our defence force is actually very small, but you know, give what we can. If every NATO country gave 1% of what they had, Zelensky said that would make a big difference. But they could easily give 10%. They're not going to need it very soon, especially if Ukraine wins. And there's also risk worth taking, and you can manufacture and purchase more. Okay, going to take a few months, maybe even a few years to make up that loss. But it's better for these Western countries that Ukraine does the fighting rather than Russia does. Big NATO build-up demonstration inside Finland. Okay, they're not in NATO yet, but if the Americans or the Brits or so on send troops, that would worry the Russians had to dispatch troops up there, so they couldn't send so many troops to Ukraine. But Severodonetsk is gonna fall. After that, could Russia start to slow down because the losses are just so heavy? The Ukrainians might be in more defensible positions. It's sometimes worth it, as Vauban said, to cede territory for the sake of having more defensible frontiers. Eventually try and regain that land. But I mean, there have been some local Ukrainian counteroffensives not very effective. I thought, should they go and invade Russia, take Belgorod, the Ukrainians, and when that would disrupt the transport of the Russians, maybe. And the Belarusians have been staging big war games on Ukraine's northern frontier to worry the Ukrainians. So they had to guard that frontier in case the Belarusians pile into the war. And you know, Russia might be really short of manpower. Say, Belarus, you have to do this. You can't just expedite it by invading us through there. You have to, in fact, invade yourselves. Now, the Ukrainians did say there were some Belarusian soldiers with the Russian army. I don't think that's been verified. It might well be true. If there were some Belarusians, it wasn't a significant number. But Belarus could put all its weight into this war because Belarus doesn't have that much to lose, as the sanctions on them are almost as severe as on Russia. I'm surprised Armenia hasn't been strong-armed because, you know, they're completely economically dependent on Russia. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, these countries are really suffering because their economies are so linked to that of Russia. But some of the unemployed people there might be forced to join the Russian army because they just got no other way to feed their families. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel. Okay, toodaloo.